Hi, welcome to the webinar, Purchasing Carbon Offsets 101. Next slide. The speakers today will be myself, Ruby Woodside from Second Nature. We also have Kelly Hamrick from Ecosystem Marketplace, Tani Colbert-Sangri from Duke University, and Ryan Erke from Green Mountain College. Next slide. So the agenda for today, first of all, I will briefly discuss the use of carbon offsets within the context of the climate leadership commitments. Then Kelly will give an overview of the voluntary carbon market and how the sector works. After that, Tani will discuss the work that Duke is doing with carbon offsets, including considerations for choosing projects. And then finally, we'll hear from Ryan at Green Mountain College about their recent experience buying offsets. And then at the end, we should have some time for questions. At any time during the webinar, you can submit questions through the questions chat box on your screen. I do want to say this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be sent out to registrants and posted on our website afterwards. I just want to give a quick thank you to the corporate partners that we work with. Next slide. All right, so most people listening here are at schools that have signed one of the climate leadership commitments. So as you probably know, there are 3 commitments. A core component of both the carbon and the climate commitments is achieving campus carbon neutrality. So all signatory schools set a date to achieve carbon neutrality on campus, and they develop a climate action plan that outlines how they're going to get there. Next slide. So what does carbon neutrality actually mean? So the commitments state that all Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, as well as Scope 3 emissions from air travel and commuting, need to be eliminated. So for the purposes of complying with the commitments, this is the definition of carbon neutrality that schools are looking at. And then we often talk about the 3 buckets of carbon, or the different scopes of campus carbon emissions. There are, of course, many different approaches that schools can take to reduce emissions in each bucket or scope. But I just listed here some of the more typical approaches to lowering emissions from each scope. So first of all, for on-campus combustion, schools will often focus, first of all, on efficient energy systems and conservation. This can also help reduce Scope 2 emissions from purchased electricity, but Scope 2 is also where we'll often see large-scale renewable energy projects as well. And then finally, for Scope 3, which in this case for commitment signatories is air travel and commuting, many schools plan to address these emissions with carbon offsets. Of course, there are a lot of steps that schools can take to reduce travel and emissions from commuting, but it's going to be difficult to completely eliminate these emissions. So that being said, I'll talk about in a moment, carbon offsets can also be used to offset emissions from any scope. They don't just need to be applied to Scope 3. However, that's where a lot of schools typically are planning to buy carbon offsets. So one of the reasons we wanted to have this webinar is that we've been hearing from a lot of schools recently whose carbon neutrality dates are coming up. So they're beginning to think more seriously about how to neutralize that last portion of their emissions and what it actually means to buy carbon offsets. So I'm hoping that this webinar can start to answer some of those questions. And then I'm also hoping that in the future, we'll develop more resources around offsetting and buying carbon offsets. Next slide. Okay. So I also want to be clear about the types of offsets we're discussing today. So recently at Second Nature, we had a working group update our guidance on carbon offsets and introduce ideas for new types of offsets. So these new types of offsets are innovative offsets and peer-reviewed offsets. So these are offsets that have not been officially third-party verified, but they're from usually local projects that schools develop themselves. And then what the working group agreed was that because these are newer types of projects and that they're unverified emissions, that schools in the Climate Leadership Network can only use them to offset a portion of their Scope 3 emissions. So the idea here is that this supports innovation at schools and it supports local community engagement, but it also ensures that there are still some robust requirements for achieving carbon neutrality. But then today, what we're focusing today's webinar on is traditional offsets. So these are kind of traditional third-party verified offsets that follow an existing and accepted carbon program. These offsets can be bought and sold. They can be applied to any scope of emissions. So schools can buy these offsets to neutralize any greenhouse gas emissions on campus. Next slide. You can go back one more slide. So a little more detail about what is a traditional carbon offset. And we'll talk about this more later on as well. But As I mentioned, schools can use to offset, they can use these to offset any scope of emissions on campus, so it does not only need to be applied to air travel and commuting. And then if your school uses carbon offsets, you should report it to Second Nature as part of the annual progress evaluation. And so these are types of projects that they follow accepted carbon offset protocols through existing greenhouse gas programs. They've all been validated and verified by accredited third parties to ensure that the carbon reductions are actually happening. And then I also just want to mention that there are many types of projects that can generate offsets. Just for a few examples, you could see offsets from forestry or reforestation projects. It could be renewable energy from fuel switching, landfill methane capture, just to name a few, and we'll also talk about this a little bit more later. Next slide. So as I mentioned, if you're buying offsets to comply with the climate leadership commitments, the offset purchases should be reported in a reporting platform. So this is a screenshot of the annual progress evaluation, and this is where you'd report yearly on your greenhouse gas inventory. So as you can see here under the tab for mitigation data, there's a section called offsets, and that's where you would enter the volume of offsets purchased, the program that the offset has been verified to, and then there's some room to describe the type of project that you're buying from. So what will happen when you enter the offsets here is that the reporting platform will automatically subtract this from your net emissions. So on the school's profile page, there's a graph showing the gross and net greenhouse gas emissions from campus. And so if you buy offsets, you'd see the net emissions are lower to reflect that purchase. And then here you can also see underneath that there's a question about offsets sold. So that's just for a few schools that are part of our carbon credit and purchasing program. And so a few schools are actually generating and selling their own verified carbon credits. But if you're just buying credits to offset emissions, then you wouldn't need to worry about that. Next slide. Great, so I know the link won't work on everyone's screen, but I just wanted to share that our carbon markets and offset guidance is available online on our website. And then also if schools have any questions about offsets or would like to talk about more about this, you're welcome to reach out to me. And we can send out these slides to registrants as well. Great, so with that, I will pass it off to Kelly to talk about the voluntary carbon markets.
Great, thank you so much, Ruby. And just double checking, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thanks again. Thank you for organizing this and for inviting me to speak. For everyone on the call, my name is Kelly Hamrick. I'm a senior associate at Ecosystem Marketplace. Next slide, please. So before I begin, I just want to introduce my organization, Forest Trends. Ecosystem Marketplace is a program of Forest Trends, and we provide information at no cost about ecosystem markets. We do this mostly by writing reports, newsletters, and articles that cover carbon, biodiversity, water markets, and more. So regarding carbon, we produce 2 annual reports. The first is the state of the voluntary carbon markets, and the second is the state of forest carbon finance. So if you're interested in learning more about carbon markets globally, I would encourage you to check these additional reports out and more. Next slide, please. So what are offsets and how are they made? A carbon offset represents 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent reduced, avoided, or sequestered. But in English, they basically represent emissions reductions. And how these are reduced, project developers employ a variety of activities to reduce emissions, from installing efficient light bulbs to planting trees. So historically, projects producing voluntary carbon offsets were unregulated, which led to concerns about quality in the market. So in some of sort of the worst cases, there were some project developers that said they had reduced emissions when later researchers actually found that no emission reductions had actually taken place. So that's why back in sort of the mid-2000s, maybe around 2007 or so, a bunch of independent third-party standards arose and tried to make sort of rules and procedures that all projects should follow. So this slide shows sort of the typical steps that happen. And please keep in mind that the specific steps might vary depending on what standard a carbon project follows. But generally, a project developer begins by outlining what they expect the project will do in a project idea note. And then following that, they will select a methodology which has sort of more specific rules about their project type, and will detail how exactly they'll make the emissions reductions in the project design document. And then after that, a third-party organization, which is not the standard body or the project developer, will then validate the project to make sure that sort of what they said is going to happen is happening. And then finally, when the emissions reductions have actually occurred, typically the same sort of third-party validator will come back out and verify that the emissions reductions have actually taken place. And then once this has happened, that's the point when the standard bodies will issue offsets to the project developer. So I just wanted to put this in here just because there's a lot that goes into the making of a project, and it sometimes can take several years before a project even gets to the point of issuing an offset that's available for sale. Next slide, please. So that being said, most of what we track is what is shown here, which is what actually happens in the voluntary carbon markets. So what we really track in our reports are what happens, how offsets are traded, and who they are sold to. So after issuance, an offset can be sold to voluntary carbon buyers, but there's really no centralized marketplace for buyers and sellers to meet. So finding a buyer is often one of the biggest challenges in the market. So in this way, intermediary organizations called retailers or brokers often spend a lot of time marketing offsets to potential end buyers. So what typically happens, what we see, is that many project developers will sell their offsets to an intermediary who will then resell those offsets to an end buyer. But there are some cases where you have particularly savvy project developers who might already have end buyers in mind, or they might have a really good marketing campaign, and sometimes they will just sell directly to end buyers. So the one sort of point I want to make methodology-wise for what we track is we track the buying and selling of carbon offsets, and we call these transactions. And the key thing to note in this particular slide is that a single offset could be transacted multiple times before being purchased by the end buyer. And we do not consider that to be double counting. So for example, if a project developer sells an offset to a retailer, and then the retailer sells that same offset to an end buyer, the total number of offsets that we would count as being transacted would be 2. That's because the offset ownership changes hands during this time. And we do subtract it with brokerage because with the broker, they typically don't take ownership. But this is something that's typically confusing for people, so I definitely wanted to highlight it here before diving into some more of our results. And then finally, once an offset is actually purchased by an end buyer, it can and should be retired. So basically, if an end buyer is going to claim the offset as against their own emissions reductions, they need to make sure that that offset cannot be resold. If it's resold, maybe it could be claimed by somebody else as well, and then we have an issue of double claiming. So basically, when an offset is retired, it's permanently taken off the market. And then I guess just to really quickly note sort of what you see with the numbers here, this just shows some of the numbers we tracked in 2016 about the total volume that was being sold to different buyers. So you can see that there were project developers sold 20.2 million tons of offsets to retailers at an average price of $1.6 per ton. And then you can see that there's a bit of a markup there, right, between a retailer to an end buyer, where they sold 27.3 million tons of offsets to end buyers at an average price of $4.7 per ton. Next slide, please. So this is actually looking a bit more about closely at our transaction volumes. And this, I like this slide because it sort of shows the historical view. So what you're seeing here are a couple of things. The red line shows the cumulative volume that we've tracked over the years. And last year was the first year that we tracked cumulative offset transactions going over 1 billion tons, which was a pretty cool milestone. Specifically in 2016, we tracked a total of 63.4 million tons being transacted, which was a 24% decrease from the year before. However, as you can see here, the market is quite cyclical, so we don't see it as a downturn or anything. It's just the market does go up and down, and it happened to go down last year. But you can also see here that there have been some ways that policies have really influenced the market. So the light blue shows Chicago Climate Exchange traded offsets. The Chicago Climate Exchange, I think a lot of companies sort of view it as a pre-compliance program where they thought that that would then turn into a U.S. cap and trade program. And when the 2008 bill failed, basically all these offsets moved off exchange, and then pretty much no one transacted them after 2010. Another interesting thing to point out here is in the maroon color that shows pre-compliance volume for California and Australia. So many of the methodologies used on the voluntary markets were then adopted in the California cap and trade program. So some of the offset demand has also shifted to the compliance markets in California as well. Next slide, please. So I guess what I kind of find is one of the most interesting things about what we see in the voluntary markets is that basically what happens is you have a lot of discrete bilateral transactions that happen between buyers and sellers. And what this means is that prices can be all over the place. So we tracked in 2016 some prices of offsets being sold were less than 50 cents per ton, while others were being sold for more than $50 per ton, which is a pretty wide range. And as you can see here, the average we tracked was $3 per ton. There are multiple reasons why buyers might value offsets at different prices, or why sellers might be offering their offsets at different prices. And we sort of broke it out by 3 different attributes, as we call them, and they're listed here. It's project type, project standard, and project location. So what this graph is showing is it's showing the average price based on these different attributes. So for example, the lowest average price was for large hydro projects. That was at 20 cents per ton. So that's the navy blue on the far left on this chart. And then the highest price that we tracked was $11.3 per ton, and that was for offsets that came from Ethiopia. So that's just looking at the project location attribute and sort of looking at that type of average price. So there are definitely a number of factors that affect average price besides the 3 that we call out here. A few more just to sort of touch on that you should be aware of. One is the transaction size. Typically, transaction sizes, if they're smaller, the costs go up just because of the cost of having to issue and transact and then retire the offsets. I think you get some more economies of scale for the larger transactions. But in other cases too, it could be based on the project co-benefits, so benefits beyond just the carbon that's being offset. And there are a couple of other different reasons as well. But I'm going to focus on these 3. So next slide, please. So this shows a map of where all the offsets that were transacted in 2016 came from. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I just wanted to show that really these are from projects from all over the world. We do typically tend to see that North American buyers do have a preference for buying offsets in North America. And so you can see that we did track 10.1 million tons that were transacted from North America, which is a pretty large number for a developed country area. Most other offsets come from developing countries, typically from Asia and from Latin America, and to a lesser extent from Africa. Next slide, please. So I also mentioned another attribute that can affect the price is the standard being used. Within the US, most projects are verified under the Verified Carbon Standard, VCS, the Climate Action Reserve CAR, which is in the light green there, and the American Carbon Registry, which is in the orange. So this is where it gets a little tricky. I think sometimes with the average price that we see based on standards, I don't actually think it's necessarily because of the standard itself that people are paying more or less. There are a couple of other things to keep in mind. So for example, VCS I think typically has lower average prices because they often will issue credits to projects that are quite large. And so you get that economy of scale going on where some of these projects are selling 1 million tons at a time. And they're willing and able to offer a much lower price point than, for example, projects under Plan Vivo. Plan Vivo is a standard that really only issues offsets to projects that come from small-scale community forestry projects in developing countries. Of course, doing some sort of tree planting project in, for example, Ethiopia is going to be a lot more costly. And so I don't think it's a surprise that we're seeing higher average prices for them. Next slide, please. And then finally, I also mentioned the project type. So we asked people to respond to our survey about what they sold and to tell us the project type associated with the offset. And I think we have about 32 different project types that you could choose from. I rolled them up here into 8 different categories. But the general gist of this is that most of the offsets that we tracked being transacted in 2016 came from either renewables projects or forestry and land use projects. However, you can see here there's quite a bit of difference in average price. So renewables, which can include like a wind project, typically sold for a lower average price than forestry. And so the value actually of forestry was triple that of renewables. Next slide, please. And then just to touch on sort of one other thing. So one thing we ask, and keep in mind our survey is going out just to suppliers in the market, not to buyers, but we asked suppliers what they thought the main reason was for a buyer purchasing their offsets instead of someone else's offsets. So this isn't buyers themselves responding to us, so sort of take this with a grain of salt. But as you can see here, buyer main concerns when purchasing offsets were co-benefits. So I mentioned before, there are a lot of projects that aren't just reducing carbon or an equivalent greenhouse gas, but they're also providing a lot of other benefits, which could be to communities, it could be to protect or try and increase or safeguard biodiversity. It could be to try and help local populations adapt to climate change. Could include employment or training or others. You can see sort of the main benefits that buyers were interested in here is mostly community benefits. So 35% of offsets, buyers chose those particular offsets because they like the community or other co-benefits. For other buyers, however, though, cost was the main concern. That was 25% of offsets were sold just because they were the cheapest. And then a couple of the other motivations are here. The one I think might be a little misleading is the 6% project location. I do speak with a lot of suppliers in the market, and a lot of them do say that location is a very big concern to buyers. I think part of the reason why this number is so low is just because it might not be the primary concern. We asked them just to choose one single concern when choosing from this drop-down list. So my best guess would be that maybe this is sort of the secondary concern that buyers have when they're choosing an offset, because I have heard a lot of anecdotal stories about how that is actually something that buyers want. They want projects to benefit the communities that are close to them, which I think has also, we've seen with this university local offsetting protocol that's being developed. So I think, sorry, next slide, please. So I think that's it in terms of sort of a really fast overview of what's happening in the voluntary carbon markets. I'm more than happy to take questions at the end of this, but for now I will stop talking and let the next panelists share what they're doing. Thank you.
All right, hi everyone. Can you go to the next slide, please? My name is Tani Colbert-Sangri, and I work at Duke University for the Carbon Offsets Initiative. We are an office, we are the only office in the higher space of higher education that currently has full-time staff employed developing and implementing carbon offset projects, researching and creating new offset protocols, and developing guidance documents to help the rest of the academic community engage in this space and purchase offsets in a responsible way, and also develop their own projects to reinforce academic missions. Next slide, please. So we got started in the space following our 2007 signing of our carbon neutrality commitment, and we set our target for 2024, and our climate action plan has us reducing emissions by about 50%, but then that leaves about 50% of our emissions footprint that will need to be offset through carbon offset projects. So we decided, or not me, but the people that came before me and our administration decided if we're gonna achieve carbon neutrality using carbon offsets, we didn't just want to do it in the cheapest and the quickest way, we wanted to do it in a way that was really gonna reinforce what we stand for as an institution through our academics and through supporting communities that we've got a relationship with. So we created the Carbon Offsets Initiative to develop carbon projects that were going to hit on those goals back in 2009. Next slide, please. So the vision was to make Duke a model climate neutral institution and to use that experience, to share that experience and help others do the same using carbon offsets as a tool to achieve those goals of climate neutrality. Next slide, please. So this is what our emissions footprint looks like, just real quick. we're able to focus internally. Obviously that is the priority when you're trying to get to carbon neutrality. But given that our target is pretty ambitious, we could reduce internal emissions by about 50% from our 2007 levels. And that target that we've got is about 185,000 tons of offsets that are needed on an annual basis starting in 2024. So it's important to note here that 2025, we need that same amount of offsets and in every year following until we're able to reduce our internal footprint. And that's why internal reductions are really the priority. But from our office's perspective, it's our mission to find projects that are going to fulfill our carbon budget of 185,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions reductions credits. Next slide, please. So I mentioned our mission. The primary goal here is that we do fulfill that commitment to be carbon neutral by 2024, and that we do that in a way through projects that are going to provide connections to our educational goals, provide student educational opportunities, and connect to faculty and staff research projects. One of the key pieces here is geographic relevance to Duke. So that's a connection to, within the state of North Carolina, connection to our study abroad programs, connection to ongoing research that may be occurring somewhere in the world. That's what we consider to be geographically relevant. And then the co-benefits of the projects that Kelly mentioned, we really want these projects to not only hit on that key, emissions reduction component, but also to be benefiting communities that we have this connection with through the co-benefits piece. And by localizing those co-benefits and developing projects within communities that we already have that relationship with, we think we really can accomplish that goal. And then to share this experience with the higher education network and community, and help others to not make the same mistakes that Duke has made when venturing into the realm of carbon offsets. Next slide, please. Oh, you skipped one. Go back, please. Thank you. So I think it's important here to sort of speak to the difference between offsets and RECs and RINs. So that's renewable energy certificates and renewable identification numbers for that are attached to renewable fuel sources. So offsets represent, as pictured in the bottom left corner here, that landfill gas destruction project, flaring methane to turn it back into CO2, and the global warming potentials of methane versus carbon dioxide result in emissions reductions occurring. So that reduction of atmospheric greenhouse gases as measured by carbon dioxide equivalents is really critical to the definition of offsets. It's not an offset unless it results in an emissions reduction. With RECs and RINs, which I'm going to talk about basically as the same thing, one is for electricity, one is for fuel source, but both represent renewable energy. And these are attributes that are attached to that renewable energy when it's created that can be separated off of that renewable energy. So as those electrons come from the solar or wind panel, there's no way to track those electrons to who's using them on the grid. It's a tool to help further these types of renewable energy projects. It's really valuable. And a lot of schools use RECs and RINs very appropriately to address their Scope 2 emissions. So that would be for electricity for RECs. RINs can be applied to other fuel sources. If you think of the key difference, though, between offsets and RECs is that with RECs, RECs are generated from at the point of generation based on the capacity of renewable energy. So you can apply your RECs that you purchase to the electricity that you use and the emissions that are represented in your Scope 2 emissions. When you apply RECs to the electricity that you're using, that you're consuming on campus, you are effectively displacing the emissions from the fuel source that was providing your electricity before. The reason that this doesn't necessarily result in an emissions reduction is because that fuel source that was producing electricity for you previously is now being used somewhere else in the grid. So there are renewable energy projects that result in emissions reductions. The key thing here is you have to identify whether it's a coal-fired plant, natural gas plant that is not coming online because renewables have been added instead, or you have to be able to draw the direct line and document that these fossil fuels have been taken offline as a result of this renewable energy project. So I hope that helps explain a little bit of the distinction between offsets and RECs. I think it can be a difficult concept to get, and within our conversations within this space, those two terms are often used incorrectly interchangeably. So I hope that helps a little bit. Next slide, please. When we think about carbon offsets, what we're really looking for are, when an offset represents that legitimate reduction in emissions, it needs to hit on those 5 PAVR requirements. So the first is that project going to result in a reduction that will last in perpetuity, that is permanence? Is the project additional? Would it have resulted in, would the project have occurred in the business as usual scenario? If it would have, then that's not a non-additional project. Is that project verifiable and backed up with data? And is the reduction counted once and only once? And is there a mechanism to, punish actors that are double counting emissions from projects, emissions reductions? And then is the project based upon legitimate accounting methodology and not the result of false accounting methodology? Next slide, please. So I want to zoom in on additionality just for a second, because it is one of the more difficult concepts, because it is definitely subjective. So the definition of additionality, spoken another way, the funding that generates from the generation of offset credits is what needs to tip the scales for the project. So the way I like to think of it is you have to identify project barriers that funding is overcoming, and therefore that funding is enabling the project to move forward. I do want to bring up this report on the left side of the slide here that was commissioned by the European Union in 2016. It takes a look at clean development mechanism that was created by the UN after the Kyoto Protocol. And this report pretty staggeringly revealed that about 85% of CDM projects have a low likelihood that emissions reductions are additional and not overestimated. So that is a pretty staggering figure there. And CDM, I would say, is considered one of the least stringent of the greenhouse gas programs that exists. Program like the Climate Action Reserve, the American Carbon Registry, the Verified Carbon Standard, they do typically place higher requirements through their protocols. So I would expect numbers through those voluntary market sources to be much lower than what they are for CDM here. But it does speak to the fact that within the voluntary market space, additionality is a real issue and something to make sure, if you're supporting a project, that you check it out and you review the verification document and see how additionality has been assessed through this project. So what we recommend is that when you're considering a project, you should always assume that the emissions reductions are non-additional until you find evidence that proves otherwise, and really employ an approach of gathering that project knowledge yourself. So start with developing an understanding for that project type, so you know what questions to ask and where the errors might be occurring, and then to try and identify what is that project barrier that the project implementer was able to overcome that made this project turn it into a reality. And that could be a financial barrier, that could be a partnership barrier, bringing together the right people to make this project happen, or it could just be a bureaucratic barrier. Maybe there's a lot of steps involved to move a project forward, and you just needed a dedicated person to make that project happen. So interviewing key stakeholders is really critical to this process to assess additionality, and we would recommend that you should do that for yourself for the projects that you're considering supporting through offset purchases. Next slide, please. So, we mentioned a lot of different project types through this presentation so far, and these are all projects that Duke has taken a look at, done some research, and oftentimes supported pilot projects for. Basically, what I'm trying to present with this slide is just that there is a wide menu of choices, and some of the work that we do at Duke is trying to expand that menu of project type options in the offset market even further. So the way we do that is by developing protocols for carbon offset projects, because if you can think of a way to reduce emissions in a reliable and traceable manner, and you can find data, then conceivably that you could turn that idea into a carbon offset project. And that project, if it's well received, could be included in the offset market space through CAR and ACR and BCS, and then that could be an option that everyone has at their disposal for addressing climate change. So that is another part of the work that we do at Duke, and I definitely welcome any interest in that if you'd like to follow up. Next slide, please. So I'll get over, now I'm gonna shift to kind of talking about the guidance documents that we've created at Duke. So this first guidance document is kind of like a Carbon Offsets 101 co-benefits guide. The co-benefits have been discussed a lot. That's definitely a priority for the projects that we support, is finding projects that are going to add to educational missions, provide research opportunities, allow us to socially engage with different communities that we have a connection to or that we want to build a connection to, the environmental benefits, beyond the emissions reduction, the ability that a project has to scale past that pilot phase and really have an impact on a global scale. That's another huge co-benefit that we look for. And then the public relations benefits and partnership building opportunities. You should be able to tell an incredible story about every carbon offset project that you are supporting. It shouldn't be an under the table deal where you are supporting a landfill gas project, and maybe because that's not such a sexy project, you don't want anyone to know like how you are addressing your air travel emissions for the year. So basically make sure that the project that you're supporting is something that you want to get a lot of feedback on, you want to spread as wide and as far as you can, and is really going to support the sustainability work that you're accomplishing at your institution. Next slide. So we've got the RFP guide as well. Because we have a dedicated office at Duke for carbon offsets, we often receive requests from folks like South Pole, Climeco, TerraPass, offset brokers who are looking to sell us offsets. And we get a lot of these requests, so this is something that we developed for our internal purposes, but I think would be really helpful and useful to share. It certainly reflects Duke's priorities in offset projects, but it could be a good reference point for developing something similar for your institution. When we get a request, someone's offering to sell us offset credits, we send them this request for proposal asking them to build the case for why their projects are going to check off all the boxes that we like to check when we're supporting a project. So we ask them to build the case, to give us all the project info, show us that the project's real, where it's located, but then to definitely describe the co-benefits. What are the educational benefits and opportunities presented by this project? What are the other co-benefits? And definitely making sure that there's not a negative PR result that might come from this project. Next slide, please. So the last guidance document that I'll share is we've developed a list, about 3 for about 2 or 3 pages worth of questions that we think are really good to consider when you're trying to think through how you might develop a carbon offset program within your institution. And so this is not necessarily developing an office, devoting full-time staff to this, but incorporating carbon offsets into your existing sustainability work. And this list of questions kind of takes you step by step through the process of really setting up a program that is going to best serve you and your institution. What are the goals that you want such a program to accomplish, and what are the constraints that you might be faced with? And then thinking through, organizationally, how should your office be structured? One of the keys to our success here at Duke, where our office is structured, we only have to go to one person for any financial decision. That is our executive vice president. So we don't have multiple steps whenever we have a project that we think is worth supporting. We just have to get in touch with our EVP, and then we can go from there. So it's really a streamlined structure for us. Connections to educational mission and identifying those local opportunities surrounding your campus. Those are pieces that are really valuable to take into this program creation stage of things, because that's going to really, what we've found, those are some of the arguments that really help to convince those higher level administrators that this work is really valuable and is going to have a return on investment from a PR standpoint, and also to help us address our climate commitments. Next slide. So the last thing that I will mention is we have been working with our partner, Urban Offsets. They're our tree planting partner in urban areas, to come up with a solution called carbon offset bundling. And basically what we're doing through carbon offset bundling is we are purchasing third-party verified market-ready credits from Climate Action Reserve, from the Verified Carbon Standard, from the voluntary market space. And we are, because those represent definitive, accredited third-party verified emissions reductions. So we've got that legitimate emissions reductions, but not necessarily high co-benefits and not necessarily the geographic relevance that we're looking for. We do try to get credits from projects within the United States and as close to North Carolina as we can. Those projects don't always exist though. So what we've done is we're trying to increase demand for those often undervalued landfill gas projects that represent real emissions reductions, but they don't have the co-benefits that make them attractive. And so then they're undervalued, and there's a large quantity of those available on the marketplace. So that's one piece of what we're bundling, and we're bundling that together with local tree planting efforts in communities that we care about. So this planting season, 2017-2018, we have teamed up with Delta Airlines to target our business travel through Delta, and targeting those emissions that we share with Delta. And so we've purchased 5,000 carbon offsets, and then we're also planting 1,000 trees in Durham to essentially act as the co-benefits section, the co-benefits component of that offset purchase. So we're bundling the local tree planting effort with the third-party verified emissions reductions, and that is the purchase that Delta and Duke have come together around to support, to knock out the emissions from our business travel through Delta for 2017. Really what this strategy allows is gives you the flexibility to localize those co-benefits, and also allows you to reduce the risk of carbon offset projects. Next slide, please. So in wrapping up, all of these slides will be shared afterwards. You can follow these links to find those guidance documents that I mentioned. I'll also mention though that we do have a bundled offset strategy document. If you want to dive a little deeper into what that idea is, we outline it pretty well through this document. And then when talking about tree plantings, a lot of people, their first thought is, we want to plant trees on campus. And I think that that's really valuable. That's good work. That should be furthered, but it's not going to count as a carbon offset. It'll count as and internal reduction. So through the carbon sink guidance document, we just talked through how you ensure that those tree plantings are going to be additional, wouldn't have occurred otherwise, and how to include those in your greenhouse gas accounting. Next slide, please. So all of these resources and more are available on our website. And thank you so much. I will turn it over to Ryan.
Thank you, Tani. And next slide, please. Thank you. My name is Ryan Erke. I am at Green Mountain College in Poultney, Vermont. Next slide. I serve as the director of the Sustainability Office. We are a small rural school in rural Vermont. We have 850 students, 500 which are residential, 350 are limited residency, and our mission is based on sustainability. We have a core curriculum that's focused on the environmental liberal arts, and all our master's programs are focused on sustainability. Next slide, please. We have been involved with the carbon commitments from the beginning. We were helped with the creation of the ACU PCC, and then we were an early signer in 2007. We developed our climate action plan, and in 2011 we achieved carbon neutrality. This is done with a mixture of carbon reductions on site. A big initiative on campus was to switch from fuel oil for oil boilers to a biomass wood-powered cogeneration plant that you see pictured there, and we've continued to focus on reducing our carbon emissions. And this past year, we were able to mark an over 50% reduction of our gross carbon emissions. And so when you look at someone like Duke at 185,000 metric tons of carbon, and us, you see we're definitely on the smaller scale, but it provides us an opportunity to really work within a small scale to see what is possible and what sort of options we can explore quickly. Next slide, please. So we have done 3 separate offset purchases since 2011, and I'll go into detail of these, but essentially what we have done in the past since 2011 is at the end of our second year of carbon emissions, we will purchase offsets to offset those prior 2 years, and then we work each every 2 years kind of vetting what we're doing. It wasn't necessarily a choice to switch, and I'll get into that a little bit more, the different projects and why we had to switch or why we chose to switch. Next slide, please. Our first offset purchase was a partnership with our local electricity provider, and we were working with a methane capture program on Vermont farms, so anaerobic digestion on dairy farms to produce electricity. We're very happy with this project. It had a really strong local connection, so that co-benefit of supporting family farms in our region was very important to us. It was great. We really were happy with it. But that program was discontinued by the provider. They're still offering RECs, and we use those, but they were no longer interested in offering offsets. And wasn't involved with the decision when it was made for them to pull out. But as my understanding, it's just the pulling together the details of verifying those additional offsets versus the REC market, which they're pretty well established. They decided to focus primarily on the REC market and what they could offer through that program. So we had to look for something else. Next slide, please. What we did for our 2013 to 2015 carbon offset purchase, we put out a request for proposals to our students into different classes. And so we had 5 different classes researching different projects within our undergrad program and proposing different offset purchases. They presented those classes or those recommendations to campus through a series of different outreach campaigns, and we had a campus-wide vote where we used to help recommend a purchase. And we also used this to identify key attributes that were important to the campus body in choosing an offset project. So we ended up purchasing a landfill methane capture program offset, and upstate New York is relatively close. We felt good about the project. And then shortly afterwards, as we were marketing this project, we were contacted by alumni who were concerned about the landfill and its expansion in the region where they were living, which was this landfill itself. And so it wasn't a deal breaker, but we wanted to look for something different, and as we were moving forward with our carbon offset purchase for the following years. Next slide, please. So we took those priorities that were identified in that pie chart in the previous slide, and we looked for co-benefits, cost, locality to Green Mountain College, and we used those to vet possible projects. And instead of going to the campus-wide vote process, we used our Campus Sustainability Council, which has students, staff, and faculty representation, and vetted different projects. We were ended up going with we are purchasing bundled offsets through Urban Offsets. Tani mentioned the bundled offset model and the benefits of having some unique co-benefits plus the cost factor, and having that verified offset purchase option is really what was attracted to us. Next slide, please. As we look for our future offsets with the college, we're going to really keep on focusing on reducing our carbon emissions on site. That is key to who we are in our institution. And we need to, as much as possible, be mindful of the stakeholders, any concerns with the perception of the offset purchase. When we reviewed the offset purchases recently with for our most recent planned purchase, it was still something there's areas where, can we tell a compelling story with this or not? And so we really focused on an area where we could hopefully tell a strong story, and we need to be respect to that. We aren't going to know every consideration. We didn't anticipate the alumni concerns in the area, but after we heard them, we were able to go online and see that there had been protests set up specifically to that landfill. And so now we do a little bit more vetting about what the project is and what concerns might be associated with it that we might not hear from immediately, but just check in. But still, it's a bit of you can miss them at times. We do want to increase the local nature of our offsets, and we always want to be focusing on engaging our students as much as possible in the understanding of the carbon market, engaging with them and possibly visiting the sites or using them as other ways to advance their education here at Green Mountain College. And we are looking to develop longer-term relationships with our offset project. We are not interested in doing these two-year pieces. It takes a lot of time and energy, and it just happened to be that that's how it is run. But we would like to develop a longer-term relationship with an offset project so that can tailor to meet our needs, our goals, and really emphasize our co-benefits so that we can really make it an integral part of Green Mountain College and our identity. Next slide, please. There's my contact information. I'd be happy to connect with anyone, and I'll turn it over to Ruby for questions.
Great, thank you, everyone. So if folks on the line have questions, you can go ahead and enter them into the questions box. We've gotten a few so far. So one question was asking whether or not Second Nature has considered acting as a broker to source offsets from developers and then reselling them to signatories to help schools get a better price. And I'll say that yes, we've considered this a little bit. We've also kind of talked about some type of aggregated carbon offset purchase and helping schools in the network get together and hopefully achieve some type of economy of scale. So I would say, it's something that I'm interested in for sure. And if we hear from more schools that there's strong interest and that there's a need for this, then it's definitely a role that we would look into more seriously. So I would say for schools that are on the line, definitely reach out to me and let me know kind of where you are in terms of thinking about offsets. And if it's something that schools are seriously interested in, then we can consider it at Second Nature. Let's see. Another question is whether or not the same solar energy company can generate RECs and offsets. And I want to thank Tani actually for talking about the difference between RECs and offsets, because we do get a lot of questions about that. So I would say, so certainly the same company could generate both RECs and offsets. The same, one particular solar panel or project cannot develop both RECs and offsets at the same time, because then you could potentially get into the challenge of double claiming the same environmental attributes as credits. So, as Ryan was talking about the project that decided to switch from offering offsets to just focusing on RECs, it kind of really depends on the company as to what's going to be most financially feasible for them. If there's a really strong REC market, it might make more sense for the solar company to generate and sell RECs. However, if there happens to be a if they're in a situation where they can prove additionality and that there's a strong market for the offset, then they could do that. But the same project is not going to generate both RECs and offsets.
Ruby, can I just add on to that? So I think that I think you're right that for a solar project, you have to decide offsets or RECs, but there are some projects that the circumstances of those projects allow you to generate both offsets and RECs. So if you think about at Duke, we've done a swine waste to energy project. We have an anaerobic digestion facility that's operating at a 9,000 head swine farm in Western North Carolina. And we are capturing the methane, using it as biogas. We are destroying the methane, turning it back into carbon dioxide. And then we are also generating electricity by using the destruction, the heat that's generated through that destruction, putting it through a micro turbine and generating electricity. So it does tend to vary. You should check your state and local utility regulations. Some states will allow a renewable energy project to generate both offsets and RECs. And North Carolina is a state that does allow that because the RECs are generated from that generation capacity. The number of megawatts that a facility is generating, that is what directly correlates to the number of RECs that are created. Whereas the displaced fossil fuel or the destruction of the methane, that is considered separate. So it does vary depending on what state you live in, and depending on what state you do live in, that it's important to check that and before you are trying to claim both from a project.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that's a good point. It's a good example of, some projects, depending on what it is, could potentially generate both. Okay, so let's see. Another question, I think for both Ryan and Tani, maybe Kelly as well. So what advice would you have for someone developing an offset program for the first time, specifically for schools? So I'll give it first to Tani, and then maybe Ryan can add something as well. So what advice would you have for schools that are starting to think about this?
Yeah, so what I would say is the key thing to think about is how you're going to be structured. You want to have that direct line to your financial decision makers. You don't want multiple hoops to have to jump through. And then on the project side of things, if you are thinking of developing your own projects, what we've really found critical over the past 9 years of having this office in place is that it's an incredible time commitment to develop a project yourself. Not just, so what we spend a lot of time on is getting those projects off the ground, but then the project management of those projects on an ongoing basis, the logistics, that is incredibly time consuming. And so the key for us that we've identified is you need to find that community partner who is working in that space already, who is able to act as that project manager for you and allow you to operate in the space of fulfilling that strategic direction, and also connecting to academic value to the project. Go ahead, Ryan.
I think for us, it's been really important to have someone, an intermediary for us, not necessarily a community partner. We aren't developing our own projects, but someone we have developed a good working relationship that can really help us vet projects and identify what's key to us. And so for us, it's knowing exactly why we want to do it and what we're going to try to, those key co-benefits that we want to do, be able to communicate to those well. So having that information and being able to work then with a broker or retailer on that side would be important, and setting up kind of the first steps to what we're doing and identifying our projects that we want to pursue.
Great, thanks. And then Kelly, I guess, as someone who works a lot with carbon markets kind of from a higher level and seeing market trends, is there any advice that you would give to schools that are thinking about purchasing offsets?
It's funny, yeah, at least with the previous question, usually when I hear people ask, what should I think about when I'm developing a project, my biggest answer is, who's going to be the buyer? Obviously, if it's a school that intends to purchase those offsets, it's sort of a different situation, but that is sort of typically what I see in the market. In terms of, I guess, advice for when you are purchasing offsets, I think it is something that's really hard to generalize because everyone does have something different that they're looking for. Some organizations really want to have specific co-benefits. I think we saw in the previous panelists with their presentations. It might try and align specifically with the school's mission or try and directly help local communities that are nearby the school. In other cases, at least on the global voluntary markets, we sometimes see buyers who really only care about cost and everything else is secondary. And so there definitely are some buyers who sort of, I guess, would be the opposite of what Tani was describing, where I don't think they really know anything about the projects themselves. They purchase the offsets through a third-party retailer or broker, and then they claim them, and then they were done with the matter. But I think, kind of to his point on, you can spend a lot of time researching these projects. So I think just making sure, depending on what you want to do, making sure that you have enough time and resources, because if you want to, you can go down a rabbit hole and look at every single project that you might want to purchase from and examine all of their finances and examine all of the stakeholder engagement they've done and really, have a dedicated team just looking at that. Or you can contact a third-party retailer and really do very little in terms of engagement with the project. So it's sort of up to each individual buyer, but there is, I think, a scale on how involved or engaged that you can be.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's a really good point. So we're about out of time. I want to answer one more question because I think it's a really important one that we've heard from a lot of schools, which is, so what advice do you have that could help convince some skeptical senior decision makers on campus that offsets are a good idea? And so I wonder if Tani and Ryan, if you have any thoughts about that, as how you would make a case to senior leadership that offset purchases are a good idea. Tani first.
Sure. Yeah. So I think this is kind of the crux of the issue that we're dealing with. The way that we typically make that argument, and we're fortunate to have a pretty supportive administration at Duke, is talking about the communities that are going to be benefited, how we're responsibly addressing our climate neutrality commitment, and the community, the story that we can tell. So a lot of it does end up being, what is the PR value of this project? But the other critical piece is the connection to ongoing research projects and the ability to develop a project in partnership with important, large organizations within your community or larger businesses. So our partnership with Delta was a really big success. Delta and Duke already have an existing relationship, and that's a very exciting partnership that our executive vice president wanted to move forward and wanted to devote some resources to. So partnerships, educational value, and highlighting the co-benefits and the community impact.
Yeah, on Green Mountain side, I'd echo what Tani had said. I think earlier on in the presentation, you talked about not wanting to sweep things under the rug and stuff. This is definitely could be a big PR option and way to trumpet the quality and the commitment of the college. And I think tying it to the education piece is really the unique spot. As long as we can tie with the education component of our school, it's important for us to do.
Great, thank you. So we're out of time. I just want to say a huge thank you to our presenters, to Kelly, Tani, and Ryan. And thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. Feel free to follow up with questions. I'm always happy to talk about offsets. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Ruby.
Yeah, thanks, Ruby. And those slides will get emailed out to registrants, so you can follow those links.
Thank you all.
Cheers.